like in the room and you've got 3, 4 people, are you doing the sort of checkerboard edit where you take out one, or are you doing gates, or what are you doing there?
Yeah, so we started off, it was pretty bare and simple. It was just like record every stream and then go through and cut each piece that reflects to kind of clean it up. And then it kind of got better over time. We started upgrading our equipment. Obviously, if you have a better microphone, then it gets a little clearer. We recently just switched to the Rodecaster, which is super awesome because you get everything in one and it's super clean. And there's not a ton of editing, which makes all of the post-production time a lot faster. So it's been a little bit of a progression, but yeah, we've started from all the way in the bottom having like the Blue Yeti microphones and just recording directly into the computer to recording the audio separate on the camera, then resyncing it. And yeah, it's coming together. It's nice.
Very cool. And let's do some more live editing. So if you've ever seen the YouTube channel, youtube.com/podcasters roundtable, there's always a thumbnail, and I like to feature the new roundtabler, someone different each time on the thumbnail. But this has me going through every I download every archive from, the archived episode from YouTube, and then I scrub through. And by the way, let me tell you, no one looks good on pause. There are stuff that I would love to post here that and sometimes I do it to Daniel, Dave, and I just to be funny when I don't have a thumbnail. And on StreamYard, Google Hangouts used to do the full screen automatic, like it would highlight, and I love the camera switching, which I'm hoping StreamYard gets that. Come on, StreamYard, you could do it. You can do that part. And but if I remember, I feature someone. So Jared, I'm going to feature you.
Cool.
And what I'm usually looking for is like a smile. I try to find where someone's smiling. Everyone wants their best foot forward, I think, most of the time. But you could do wacky gestures. I also love like hand movement, like anything that makes a thumbnail catchy. Don't worry, no one actually sees this because everyone listens to the podcast. No one watches unless they watch live and they don't see the thumbnail. But here we go. Jared, give me that smile. I caught him by surprise. There we go. All right. Look at all these live. This is going to make, speaking of editing and all that work that Jared's doing in post-production and production, this is some of the stuff that I do that I just made my life easier. So because we don't actually pay anyone to help, we are indie podcasters. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, how podcasters, especially ones without, I would say, large budgets or big teams, go about finding new audiences. And I was thinking about this the other day. It kind of all came together because I told my wife, I need a new podcast. And I felt like I didn't really know how to get it. And I was like, this is me speaking, like someone who's been around the space for quite a while. And, nothing was, I felt I couldn't just type in my interest. It didn't necessarily, like I told Dave before we started, he was playing a little song. And I said, I'm playing bass guitar and I'd love to play, sit in with you sometime and jam. And, but I wouldn't look for a podcast on bass. Maybe I watch plenty of YouTube channels on bass. So anyways, I felt like I was having a hard time finding a new podcast. And I've mentioned this before. I never have an issue finding new creators. It's funny how we call them creators. I guess you call them YouTubers too, but I never have a problem finding new channels on YouTube. I mean, like it's almost like a 50-to-1 ratio. For every 50 YouTube channels that I subscribe to, maybe I subscribe to one podcast. I know we talk about podcasting doesn't have a discovery issue. That's what you hear. Sometimes you hear that it does. To me, it seems like an issue. It's an issue for me personally. So I'm curious, how do you guys find new podcasts? Jared, like when was the last time how long ago did you find a new podcast? Well, first of all, let me ask, are you subscribed to like a ton of podcasts and you only listen to a couple like Dave? Or Dave, do you probably listens to all? He can explain. But Jared, do you listen to a ton? Do you listen to a couple?
Yeah, so I probably listen to like 10 to 12 regularly. 10 to 12 channel or podcast channels, right? But
wait, I would said that. Wait, it makes me think you're also talking about podcasts that are on YouTube.
No, this is strictly audio. Yeah.
All right. I just want to make sure because we are using audio channels.
And, sorry. It's always weird to call it a channel or a feed or so yeah, it's like 10 to 12 normally. That are like in heavy rotation, that are either daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the cadence is. But I probably am subscribed to about 20 plus. And a lot of those, maybe they're only like once a month, so I'll forget about them until they pop back up or whatnot. But that's kind of like in heavy rotation are those 10 to 12. And I just recently found a new one actually this morning, but it's because I was looking for that specific podcast on a particular topic. just to see if something was out there. And I guess the most fascinating thing is it's starting to become like YouTube, where you can kind of just type in anything and you'll probably find something or some type of podcast on it. It could just be, one episode, or maybe it's just a dead link, but there's like something for everything now. It's become so widely spread.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
that. As opposed to YouTube, you have to be active. You have to go get it, right? Where YouTube shows it to you. And this is why I discover lots of content that I might not even have gone looking for. And obviously, there's a difference between an open system and a walled garden. We don't want to do that to podcasts, but the platforms themselves could probably handle this. But before we jump into that, Daniel, how often do you find a new podcast? Or is it that you find a lot, but you're very selective about what you subscribe to? What is it?
I'm very selective. Recently, I've been trying some new podcasts because I just wanted to branch out outside of my little bubble or echo chamber of podcasts that I listen to that tend to recommend each other. So I wasn't getting fresh recommendations or other things. I wanted to try some of the more popular podcasts to see what makes them popular. Why are they so popular? Why do people love them? And maybe see, might I enjoy some of these too? So there are 4 different ways that I discover podcasts. Although the 4th, I'll jump to that one, is not so much discover, but find. And that is when I know the topic. Like, I started playing the video game Borderlands 3, and I wondered, is there a podcast about this? Because I want to learn more about what's going on with Borderlands and all of these things to the game. So I just searched the podcast app Borderlands to see if there was a podcast. So I knew the kind of podcast I wanted. I knew the topic. It was easy to find then one like that. But how I then discover a podcast that I might not have thought to look for would be either asking people for recommendations. And I ask for specific recommendations, not just, hey, what's a good podcast? I ask, what's a funny podcast? What's a truly funny podcast? Or what's a business podcast that's really helped your business grow, or something like that? Again, it's kind of being specific to a topic, but without using a specific search term. And then even browsing the categories sometimes to see what is at the top of the charts, what shows up prominently, what seems like it's popular. Is it actually any good? Is it delivering on its promise? Which I'm surprised how many of the podcasts don't, that are highly popular. And then, of course, the mentions inside of shows or promos inside of shows. Not so much the promos, but more if the podcast is mentioned. Like, I hate that Acast recommends at the end of some of these podcasts. They never recommend anything I would be interested in, even though they say, you're going to love this podcast. No, I'm not interested in it. Oh, the browsing, something I forgot to mention about that is I have subscribed to and enjoyed a couple podcasts as a result of ads inside of the Overcast browse catalog.
Yeah, that Overcast is also, so as we're going to talk a little bit about how we help listeners find either your podcast or podcasts in general. That Overcast, the ability to advertise in Overcast in front of your niche is the single most effective thing I've ever done to get new audience. And it's appears to be sticky. Those listeners that we got from that at work are remaining with the show. So it works. It does cost money. It's one of those things where, like, if you price it out per subscriber, whatever, scale you put it on, it was like $3 per, but of course it was like a $400 campaign, right? Not something that the average podcaster can or is going to do. Dave, now you find podcasts all the time. Now, most of this sounds like, let's go a little different on this. Outside of like something that is very active, you going out and getting a podcast, do you ever get podcasts sort of just show up to you, like fall in your lap, podcast discovery?
Yeah, I had one. I was listening to a podcast and a guy named Matthew Dix was on talking about his book Storyworthy, and it was really good. And I was like, oh, I wonder if this guy has a podcast, because if not, he needs one. And I found out he did. And I went over and I downloaded like one episode, and it was really good. It was him and his wife, and I downloaded at that point all 64 of his episodes. So I found him through a podcast. I think it's Podcasting 123 or something. It's
Wait, you were listening to a podcast, or you had him on your podcast?
No, I was listening to another podcast about podcasting.
Right.
And heard him and then discovered his podcast. A lot of times, because I work at Libsyn, I have just weird titles thrown at me all the time. And I'll be like, or the one thing I do a show called Podcast Rodeo Show. And the whole point is I find a random podcast. And when I find a random podcast, I'm not really looking for something from NPR or Wondery or any of these big, I want like Joe Schmo in the basement kind of thing. And so the other night I typed in the word Neil. I don't know, as in like a guy's name. I just typed in like, let's see what Neil's up to.
Is this a Peart?
Maybe it was, probably was. So that brought up just some random podcast that I found. So it is at times, which is kind of sad that it's hard to find either everybody's calling their podcast a network. That could very easily be, a network or whatever. I rarely see somebody's name as the author. It's always like, Overture Studios. And I'm like, really? Okay. So, because I'm really looking for an indie show when I try to do that show.
So we're not the best sample, right? Because we are down in the trenches. We're hardcore podcast. We're producers, which makes us not the average listener, right? So, Jared, you help people get their podcast found, right? Is that one of the things you kind of do?
Yeah. Yep.
What do you have any like insight into like what the average person looking for a podcast, where they're getting their shows, or what do you tell your clients? Like, here's how you get in front of people, that maybe are not looking for a podcast or they're not looking for that podcast.
Yeah. So we take a really interesting approach. So we're at heart a content marketing agency. So by default, a lot of people think that's like blog posts and, small videos, things like that. So part of the reason why we started doing video podcasts in general is it gives us the ability to express ourselves on other channels, Instagram, YouTube, and by putting the video out there, it gives us a way to index through Google and, obviously YouTube again. So that's usually what we would do with a client. So if a client comes to us and is like, hey, we would like to produce a podcast. We have this great idea. How do we execute it? How do we build our audience? And the way that we usually tell them is like, obviously, if you're starting from scratch, you're going to end up in the bottom of the podcast feed. But with video, you can push yourself a little bit quicker. You can kind of like start to surface on the internet a little faster than just the audio feed. Obviously, you get tons of syndication through different podcast platforms like Simplecast or whatnot, or Libsyn, which gets you on all the audio platforms. But how do you get in front of people that don't always listen to podcasts, like you're saying, or don't necessarily even know that Spotify may have a podcast section? So the way we do this is we use promotion through other social channels, through obviously their website, through email campaigns. But we find that using small clips from the podcast in a video format will definitely help you rise to the top a lot faster and kind of start getting a little bit closer to critical mass a lot sooner than if you just had an audio stream.
You say rise to the top. I might have missed that part of it.
Sorry. Yeah. So rising to the top of like the particular topic. So let's just say your topic is real estate and you want to be, top 10 in iTunes. It's going to be a lot easier to get up there faster if you can get into a wider audience and cast the net wider. So if you're just casting to the audio land, it's not as wide as the video land, right? You said yourself, you're finding channels on YouTube a lot easier. So we find if you create a podcast centric channel in YouTube or a playlist in YouTube that focuses on the content in the podcast, and maybe you don't necessarily give the entire episode, maybe you just give like the highlights of the episode, but then you give people a reason to go and listen to the rest of the episode in the audio stream. So we find that just using YouTube and other platforms like YouTube to host video gives us a chance to really cast the net a lot wider than just the audio.
I'm curious about.
There you go. I'm looking for some co-hosts. The people in the audio won't hear this, but as I'm casting, I was telling people to go ahead as I was trying to not talk. Anyways, go ahead, Dan.
I'm curious about something that Dave said. And also, Jared, you'll probably have some insight on this. When you find a podcast you really like, as Dave, you mentioned a podcast that you downloaded all the episodes. I've done that for some podcasts. Do you find that you like the podcast so much still after you binge on it?
It's funny you say that. I spent 3 weeks consuming those episodes, and I also bought his book on audio and on Kindle. So I was nothing but Matthew Dicks for 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, I probably didn't listen to him for 3 weeks because I was kind of like, and it's like everybody's show. I mean, eventually you're going to kind of start to you're going to see the themes, the core values of the podcast are going to come out, and you're going to hear those same things again and again. So it was kind of like, okay, yeah, I know, don't use pop culture references because not everybody's going to get them in this case, and all these other things. So after a while, I was kind of like, all right, I need something besides Matthew Dicks. Let's switch over to whoever kind of thing. I don't know, Jared, do you run into that?
It's like the Netflix fatigue, right? You binge watch the entire series and you're like, okay, I'm done with Stranger Things until next season. Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to consume the media. But what you just said is kind of what my agency really focuses on, especially from a podcast perspective. So you bought his audiobook and you bought any other products he had. So a lot of times when our clients are coming to us, we're not necessarily creating a podcast for them to be the top 100 in iTunes or Spotify. If that happens, that's great. That's obviously a bigger audience they can get to. But a lot of times we're creating content to drive them back to their website to purchase more products, buy their services, look for other things that they can connect with that particular company on. So it's more of like a B2C play. It's more business focused, but we use the podcast to catapult it. And a lot of the times, the reason we use a podcast is we can get a really long piece of content easily in production. Obviously, it sounds hard, but it's actually a lot easier than writing 100 blog posts or producing, like even like a webinar series. You can record an hour-long podcast, and that can easily become 20 pieces of content that can be cast everywhere, depending on the platform.
Since you're doing this for clients, how do you measure we'll just stay in the marketing world, the ROI? Like, how are you gauging success of your podcast?
Yeah. So obviously we can go by the hardcore metrics that you get in your normal platform read back. But a lot of times it's more like we'll send them to a landing page or a specific page on the website, and we'll know exactly that they listened to this podcast or this clip from Instagram or the podcast from YouTube or wherever the platform is. We're sending them to a direct landing page, and that kind of gives us an idea, like people are consuming it and they're going back and actually interacting with the business.
Yeah. In my case, it's funny. I found that guy's podcast, talked about it on my show. One of my listeners bought his book and is actually this weekend going to a kind of boot camp that he puts on for storytelling. The other thing that he does that is interesting, because he just thinks in story. He's won like whatever it is, the Grand Poobah Master Slam of, storytelling. Yeah, like 7 times. It's nuts. And what's interesting is he does his own live event where people come up and tell stories. And so you'll listen to this really cool story because it's good, because otherwise they wouldn't have been performing live. And then he critiques it, which somewhat kind of gamifies it, because the more you listen to his show, the more you start to think like he does. So then you're like, oh, I just heard that. I know he's going to say that. So then it's a matter of, did I catch the things that he caught? So it's a weird little dynamic of that show, but it is kind of interesting. So do you set up like special URLs for like everything basically?
Yeah. So we'll create like a UTM link is usually what it's called, which is like a bit.ly link type thing. We use, depending on the marketing platform software that we're using, it could be different, but yeah, we create a special URL so that we know where the traffic's going. And then obviously on the page, we can see where, you can see where people are actually engaging on the page, if they're signing up for, an email, or if they're signing up for a content offer or whatnot, or if they want to call to talk more to that business.
Do you find that the clients think that the money invested in the podcast is worth the return?
It is, yeah, totally. Because again, going back to that method of like you're creating this long piece of content, you get so much more out of a podcast series. Like the way we usually pitch it is we'll put it into episode chunks. So 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever the amount of episodes are. That will give a particular client, 6 to 8 months worth of content that they can use to keep pushing out there, to market themselves, to get in front of different audiences. So it's in that regard, they get a lot of content for like a little bit of production.
So rewinding a little bit, who thinks podcasting has a discovery issue? Maybe we can call it issue, not problem. Is there a difference?
How do you define discovery?
Okay,
yeah.
Well, just rewind the last 15 minutes and go off that.
Well, yeah, but I heard contradictory things. Like you said, on YouTube, it's really easy to discover stuff on YouTube, but you consume stuff so differently. on
True.
YouTube. YouTube is very short.
Yep.
And it's very one-off. And that's why YouTube is such a big search engine, is people are searching for things. They watch the one video they need and they leave, or they get sucked into a cat video. That's
So
like
audio
everybody.
is the problem, is what you're saying?
The what?
Audio is the problem, is what you're saying. Long form audio content is the problem. It's not, as we talked about this all the time. I always say that audio podcasts are not they're not easy to sample.
Right. They're not easy to sample. They're much more involved. It's a much bigger commitment. It's more like a movie. Yes, there are trailers at movie theaters, but I think most of us already know about the movies even before we see the trailers because of the internet. But I think that
But just because it's harder doesn't mean, we're still,
it's different.
finding podcasts. Is it harder to find a podcast than it is other types of content? And I don't mean harder like if you sent one of us out on a mission, the way you tell someone to navigate your website and see if you can find my contact page. I'm talking about you're living your life and all of a sudden podcasts come into it. Does that happen as often as video comes into your life, a blog comes into your life, music comes into your life? Do these other platforms are they doing something different? Could podcasting be helping itself out?
Well, I think so. I find that I'm a big Spotify person for music, and every week I look forward. I think it's called my weekly discovery list, and they basically look at what I listened to last week and try to find similar stuff. And some weeks it's like, wow, that was a really cool band. I've never heard of these people, and they're
going to do that with podcasting. Then you're not getting that already. They're not doing that.
I've gotten one where it's just a full banner for a specific podcast, but I think that's more of the platform pushing their own, since they have their own podcast network now. I think that's them kind of pushing themselves.
Sure.
But I think to me, sorry, definitely did not mean to cut you off, Dave. Yeah. If that continues to happen and like these larger conglomerates start to become podcast networks like the large radio stations, I think consumption just becomes easier by nature. I think right now it's just at the infant stage of like critical mass where people are like, oh shit, I can make my own podcast and show up on all these platforms. But eventually like the cream rises to the top, right? And places like Spotify and obviously Apple has invested in a whole new platform, and whoever next is going to come up to kind of challenge them, maybe it's Google or whatnot. But I think as these larger conglomerates kind of come into play, it's going to be a lot easier to discover it.
Yeah, the true discovery problem I see, and part of it is that there's just so many, podcasts, is today I was looking for a show called Making It Real in Spotify. And if I searched for the name of the author, came right up. I typed in Making It Real, and there are a bunch of shows about making it. There are a lot of shows about being real, and I could not find a show anywhere unless I typed in quotation marks, making it real.
But nobody, you're looking for the show. So no one who's looking for a podcast who would be interested in that content is looking for the name of a show they don't know. Right.
So, exactly.
I'm trying to think about, how do you help people find, well, see, I don't want to say that because then that's specific. I was say, how do you help people find your show?
That's why I always tell people, Daniel, feel free to plug away. Subscribe and follow his plugin. You got to send people to your website. I cringe now when I hear somebody say, find me an Apple Podcast. I'm like, oh, because there's a good chance they're not. Even if you type in the exact name of the show, it's not going to show up. And the other thing people forget about this is if you send people to your website, that reinforces your brand. It gets them right to where they want to go. And if you're doing any kind of advertising, you can pixelate them. So now you got the Facebook pixel on their thing and you're promoting it to where I gotta go, why would you ever say find me anywhere? Send them to your website. And
but that sort of speaks to how you help people find your show. Do you guys do anything to help grow podcast audience? Like just people getting into podcasts, right? I mean, we do, this is what we do. We talk about podcasting. So I don't know if it's the best sample to ask us, but do we see other either organizations or people or whatever doing things to grow a podcast audience? And we've heard this, I think Rob Greenlee is where I first heard it, about how we need to grow the audience, not just our audience. We need to grow all of podcasting audience. Obviously one does the other, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
Well, for me, I don't listen to the radio a lot, but when I do, I'm always pleased as punch to hear whatever iHeart station I'm listening to promoting the crap out of their app. And now 92.3 The Fan, you can pause and rewind 92.3 Fan in the radio.com app. And I'm like, well, that's cool. And they're like, listen to other podcasts. So every time I turn on the radio, they're promoting some app to listen to podcasts. Now, granted, they're going to go in and looking for 92.3 The Fan. They're not looking for the School of Podcasting, but there's always a chance that they're gonna,
we hope they get lost when they get in there, and because they can't find things in the app, as we discovered by searching, and they're gonna find show that they actually want to listen to.
Yeah, Jared, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, just going back to that larger conglomerate thing, it just piggybacking off what you were saying about iHeartRadio. But one of the articles, Ray, that you sent over earlier, I just checked out really quick, and it said MTV launched 5 new podcasts. So right there, obviously they're finding it a worthy investment. So as these bigger media companies start launching more and more and more, I think it just becomes a platform that people will shift to eventually. But it just now becomes to the actual app, whatever you're listening, whether it's Overcast or iTunes or whatever, it becomes their responsibility to properly show the right podcast to the right audience.
Yeah, and then part of that comes from a thread. So I was hoping to get Katie in here, but it's too short notice. But at Katie Jensen had a cool thread. I think it was, maybe she posted it yesterday, but it said the podcast bubble will pop within 4 years, and then there was more about that. One of the pieces of the thread that I found interesting was she was talking about how to keep the podcast bubble aloft, not popping. She says it's really, really simple. She said build beautiful, accessible websites to convert non-podcast listeners to new audiences, which is kind of why I was thinking about, what we're doing to get new audience into podcasting. And she says, replace the churn, stop building and producing ad nauseum without giving any thought to discovery or new audience development. And then she goes on and says, spend money on print and digital spreads that pique interest, buy vanity URLs, which maybe we were hitting on, I'm not sure. And if legacy media and podcast upstarts keep depending on listenership to trend upward on its own without manually helping it, they will unknowingly contribute to the bubble bursting. And part of what she's saying is that people are getting into podcast because it's hot. They're being sold on podcasts, these big companies, kind of these conglomerates that maybe you're talking about. And because there's a lot of podcast startups out there who are producing now we're talking about the high quality. I mean, when I say high quality, I mean cost lots of money, storytelling podcasts,
Gimlet,
right?
stuff like that.
It's right. Yeah. Cost, and they're getting sold to these big companies who then they're not really being they're kind of promising this almost get rich or this high ROI that doesn't always come back because sometimes people just drop the ball after they make the podcast. So this is what she's talking about when she's talking about podcast bubble. I mean, obviously podcasting works. It just depends on how you're trying to make it work. But for a company, people might see this and then podcasting didn't work for us, right? Because they weren't really in it for either the right reasons, or they weren't speaking to the right people, or they were trying to make something that didn't fit their audience. But anyways, I thought that was an interesting thread and sort of tied together what we're talking about. And I thought that this whole, making websites, converting non-podcast listeners, do you guys, so this, when I think about this, I'm like, how are we trying to get people who weren't looking for our podcast, right? So maybe a blog, right? I do YouTubes on video. I do YouTubes on video. I said
you do.
Yeah, I do that.
I love your YouTubes, man. They're great.
I do video on YouTube, and people discover the podcast that way because they will make it over to the website and they say, "Oh, I didn't know you had a whole show," right? And so there's some cross pollination there. Bad, I can't say that word. And what do you guys do? I mean, even Jared. First, we'll ask what you guys do. Daniel, do you do anything beyond podcasting to bring new people? But then we'll ask Jared, do you have clients blog or do anything extra? You mentioned social, sort of breaking off the podcast and splitting it out. I'm kind of seeing that as more like an advertising, like a billboard type thing for the podcast. I'm thinking of maybe other content that funnels to discovery of the podcast or to your website. Daniel, what else do you do to bring in, people who weren't looking for your podcast, really?
For me, because my podcast about podcasting is educational, it answers questions. So I rely a lot on SEO, and that helps really well with content that people are actually searching for.
You're talking about you make a transcript of every episode and you post the whole thing on your show. No?
Stop there. We're not friends anymore if you keep pushing transcripts.
This is my role in this gig. All right. I ask the stupid questions and you shoot it down.
The most powerful piece of text that I have to work with is my episode title. That is what shares out on social. That's what displays in podcast apps. It's a list, like a portfolio of my content. When people see my podcast, it's the most prominent text in search engines. Most podcast apps, or the most popular ones, will also search episode titles. So if I want to be found for something, I make an episode about it. And guess what? I title the episode about that thing I'm talking about. That does work very well for that kind of content people are looking for, because I'm answering that question that they want an answer for. So they know they want an answer. They don't know necessarily whether they want a podcast or an article or a video. They just know they want the answer. And here I ended up providing it. Generally, it's through my show notes, which are article format, but still they see it. They see the play button. They see all the promotion about the podcast, everything like that. So they have that option. For my other podcasts that I've hosted in the past that have been more entertainment focused, it's been more about finding those things, as far as SEO, finding those things that people are actually searching for and my content might end up being relevant for. Like for the comedy podcast that I used to host, individual SEO didn't matter for the individual episodes. I could call those episodes whatever I wanted. It really didn't matter, because there wasn't anything specific like that people would be looking for. But that's where it's the overall keywords, like clean comedy podcast. Or with our Once Upon a Time podcast about the TV show, it was kind of a mix of both things. People were looking for things like Once Upon a Time theories, or who is Rumpelstiltskin's father, or things like that. And those types of questions were answered inside of our show notes, as well as other content on our website. Sometimes in episode titles, but usually not really. So for us, SEO was probably the best tool for us, in addition to networking with other people.
Let me ask, do you know that that's true? So I know a lot of people say, oh, I got to do good show notes, or SEO is going to do the thing, but they don't actually know where their audience is coming from. And in fact, if they do, most of their audience is not finding them through a website, right? There's been people who say, well, you don't need a website if you have a podcast. We've argued against that. But do you know this? And is it, I'm sure it is a much smaller portion of your audience, because that's not usually the biggest way people find podcasts, but I assume it's still worth it.
Well, for the Audacity to Podcast, the two most common reasons I've heard people say that they found my podcast was either, and I'm not sure which one was higher on this, so this is in no particular order, but either they say, I heard you or heard about you on this other podcast, and it's one of us here, or this very show, Podcasters Roundtable. One of you guys brings someone to Podcasters Roundtable and someone listens and then bounces out to one of the other of us. That's one way. The other way that people have told me they've often found me is through SEO. I've received the response before saying, from many people saying, every search I was doing, you were like the number one result or number two near the top of the results. So I just decided I've got to subscribe to this guy's podcast. He's got all of his content that's showing up for every one of my searches.
And I think the key to that for Daniel, because it's true, you will show up for questions about podcasting. And it's that the way you break out your show notes, they live on their own, right? You might have mentioned that, but you don't actually have to listen to the podcast. And people think, oh, that's bad, and I'll listen to the podcast. Well, it's not bad. He answered the question, and he also showed up in the search. His show is being exposed many more times than someone else doing a podcast answering those same questions. So he's going to siphon off more listeners than the person who's just doing the podcast. People are really afraid of giving it all away when it's not, either it's not behind a paywall, right? It's free in a podcast, or giving it all away in text, or you set all your tips on social, they'll never go to your podcast,
Yeah, there's two things too that Daniel does that a lot of people forget. Number one, Daniel makes it really easy to share his content. That I have people all the time. I'll go, there's no way to, unless you're going to copy the URL, and he's got share buttons on his website, and then he has an easy to find contact button. I'm surprised at the end of the year, I do an episode where I have my audience say, what was your favorite podcast of the year? Like, if you could only listen to one, what is it? And I always go out to the podcast and say, hey, so-and-so thinks you're great. Cause like, Who doesn't want to hear that? And I'm amazed at the hurdles I have to go through to try to contact somebody, because in some cases you can't. It's like, oh, well, I hope you can say that in whatever the character limit is of Twitter this week, because that's the only option. And I'm like, ugh. And how's your show going to get better if you can't get feedback from your audience?
So some tough things to do. I mean, creating the type of show notes that Daniel creates is more work. It's harder, but you can see it pays off. And then Sean McCabe, he's a good follow. You should check him out. He's in the chat. Welcome, Sean. He talks about video clips and are a really good way, kind of, what Jared is saying, but that's also can be an extra big, quite a substantial extra lift to do. And the question is it worth it, right? So people create these headliner. Headliner is fantastic, by the way. If you're not using it, this is an easy way to do it. But is that stuff worth it? Do you guys create social clips? Is this really the way people are finding podcasts, or is it just, you know what I mean? Is it worth it? I mean, I think a lot of people try to weigh out. I don't want to do all the social media, all the show notes. I have time for the podcast, and that's fine. But when it comes to growth, do you guys find that the extra stuff, Jared, the extra stuff that you have people do, is it worth even the stuff that you do?
Yeah. And I'll just say, I guess you have to go to that fundamental question, like, what's the goal of it? So if you're not, if you think you're just going to break through without doing any kind of work, obviously, no matter what it is, whether you run a YouTube channel, this, whether it's YouTube or blogging or any type of content that you're putting out there, if you do just the bare minimum, expect the bare minimum results. So breaking out the clips in that regard and spending extra time on the show notes for SEO purposes is totally worth it. I think you can't also play the short game. This is a long-term game. It's, it's like you've got to be consistently putting out content that's good quality content. You can't just put, junk out there and expect to get anything back. So I do think it is definitely worth breaking out the extra time to either do video or SEO, show notes, or both, if that regard.
If anyone from the team, I think it's Wave, they are listening. I know they listen because they pull clips, quotes, and they'll post it on their Instagram, because it's one of those services that'll, you can quote and then share on social. So thanks, you guys. I think Jared just gave them their quote there.
Nice.
So look forward to that. But I know they're listening. But JD Sutter, I'll put it up here in the chat. He says, I've never had any traction from the audiograms I've done. What would you say? What would you say to that?
I think I asked somebody once who's like, I was at a conference and there was just this social media guru. She knew Instagram and Facebook. She was just a guru big time. And I asked her, I go, what do you think about this strategy? And she goes, that will probably work if you are getting new people on your social channels, because it's a billboard. You might get a new Twitter follower. You might get somebody on Instagram, and all of a sudden here comes your little video thing. And they're like, oh, I didn't know this guy had a podcast. And so they go over, and what do? Exactly what Jared was talking about. Oh, they go over into Pocket Cast or Overcast or whatever it is. They search for your podcast and listen, and then hopefully subscribe. I wonder sometimes if that's really what it is, because I know a lot of people like, I don't get anything. But if you're not, strategically growing your social presence, because really when I see that on Facebook or whatever, I see a thing, it's like, oh, here's my new episode, and they got the squiggle line. It looks cool. And I'm like, oh, I'm already subscribed. So they're not going to get anything from me because they've already got me. But I think if I was a new person, it might go, oh, well, that looks kind of cool. I didn't know they had a podcast, or whatever. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think that also comes down to the content. If the content's good enough for you to share, even though you're subscribed, you'll share it, right? And then the whole cross-pollination thing happens. Obviously, you guys know this as professional podcasters, like having guests on your podcast that are going to have an audience that you can reach out to and they'll share the content as well is super important. This happens in YouTube all the time, right? It's the whole cross-pollination thing where YouTube channels will do a video together and then it just expands. So I think having good guests and great content, it's always great content. It doesn't matter what format.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's not so much you sharing those videos, it's your audience sharing those videos. And that is going to take more than today. On this episode, I interview Ray Ortega. Check it out.
Right.
You got to have a good tease in there to where people go, wait, what? So
something I learned from my former employer, I was a public speaker for them, is they said, as much as possible, try and speak in sound bites. something that's short, actionable, clippable. Now, in their case, I was a controversial nonprofit, and so they were concerned about people being misquoting them or, just cutting a short thing, and that's not the whole answer. But in podcasts, well, even just on the internet, we have an attention problem that people just have such a short attention spans unless you can really grip them in. And I think still the best way to grip someone in is, well, Sean McCabe is saying it in the chat, true video can grip people in if the video is interesting enough. But when it comes like the audiograms, I don't know if I've actually watched or listened to a complete audiogram ever. But some videos I've watched with the captions because that's what people do. Some, of course, images where it's, one sentence that you read yourself all by your little self. That image that's a pull quote from an episode. I see those. I read those. I think that's the thing. And I'm falling into it too. Short attention span. And I think that just audio only, even if you're putting basically subtitles on your audio with an audiogram, I just don't think that's enough to bring people in. I would think you could probably get more results by either doing a true video of some sort, if it's interesting enough to see, or making an image with a pull quote might do better than an audiogram, but I don't know.
I think the audiograms also might serve a different purpose in the way it can hook current people who, there's a lot of podcasts that you'll cherry pick. You'll see interview with Ray Ortega, and then you'll see next episode's interview with Dave Jackson. You're like, I know everything Ray has to say, but I don't know about Dave, right? So you listen to episode 31, but not episode 30, right? So, Mark Maron, I'm not going to listen to one if I generally don't know the person. An audiogram can expose content that you thought you might not be interested in, right? Something we talked about how podcasts are not easy to sample. If you give someone the best part of the podcast in an audiogram, who is even maybe already a follower or subscriber, it's a sample. And you might decide, I am going to go back and listen to that. So, I think there can be a place. Maybe it's not necessarily for pulling in new audience, although in theory, the same thing works. But it is lower hanging fruit. Like if you say, I can't create video, you can try audiograms because it works for one person doesn't mean it doesn't work for another one. So see what kind of traction does your audience start sharing them. Maybe they are like business quotes. That's like straight up great advice that, something that your audience really does want to share. I would say, give it a shot, go for the low hanging fruit and then inch up from there if you can, getting into maybe video or something else. And then again, don't stick with it if you don't, try something else.
You can even go to Spotify and share your latest episode on Instagram. I mean, yeah.
One thing I would say, and we tried this very early on in our agency podcast, we didn't always have time to record video. The audiogram thing, I always thought the audiogram thing was cool, but again, I didn't think it was going to grab people. So we would just record a 15-second clip from our phone summarizing the episode and upload that and then point back to the episode. So you don't have to necessarily record the entire thing on video. There's other ways to use video to help push people back to it.
I like the idea in terms of, because sometimes people will scrub through their content and have to edit it out just to get, that's a lot. That can be a lot of work.
Right.
But if you just take the time to sit down and do you could do it on your phone, even video, like 15-second compelling like this is, I'm summarizing it for you, right? Or this was the compelling thing or something. I mean,
we'd lay out the 3 bullet points, almost like a trailer. Like you're going to hear A, B, and C. Don't forget to subscribe, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. I like the idea in terms of just instead of trying to go back in and try to pull it out of an already created content. Sometimes there's just different ways to think about doing something that makes it a lot easier than doing it the other way.
Here's a blast from the past. Clamor. There were some times when I was out of podcasts to listen to. So this is like really long ago. But I checked out Clamor and went to the comedy category and just pressed play. And I heard some jokes I didn't appreciate, but I heard a lot of good jokes, funny jokes, things that made me laugh. And the clips were 6 seconds, 7 seconds, something like that. And what I remember about that is it served a need or a desire I had in that clip by itself. It wasn't promoting something else, although it did at the end. It would say something like, for more or for this full sketch or anything like that. It would promote that full thing. But it wasn't like the clip was saying, hey, to hear a funny story about cats, go listen to my podcast. It just told me the funny story about cats. And that worked for me. But I didn't go subscribe to any of those things. But I did enjoy them anyway.
And gotta hear an ad 7 times before you take any action, something like that, right? So just to keep out in front of people.
There is an art to a tease. Like I can't, if I start to tell you a story and I give you the punchline, I'm like, wait till you hear the punchline. Oh, oops, I just gave it to you. That's not going to work. And I think sometimes people will create a headliner just because, well, I've got to create a headliner for this episode, and there's nothing really that nobody talked in sound bites. So it's either way too long or it doesn't make sense out of context. And that's where what Ray was talking about. Just fire up your phone and make your own tease and go check it out at this website. So, because that is an opportunity. If somebody click play, that's an opportunity. And if you don't hook them in somehow, you blew it. I mean, I lucked out. I missed the last episode because I was in Boston, but I was in front of Boston talking to a bunch of speakers. And I walked into that place going, this, my friends, is what I call an opportunity, because every speaker should have a podcast. And so I walked in armed and loaded, and I walked out of there with more content and clients and all sorts of stuff. So you've got to take advantage of the stuff. And as much as we like, oh, it doesn't seem like it's a big opportunity because it only takes 2 minutes to make a headliner. Yeah, but you're getting that in front of your audience. You got to spend some time to make sure that's going to connect.
Did we talk more, Jared? Did I let you answer the question about clients and other content? If podcast is the content.
No, I think we got off on a tangent.
Of course, that's what we do here.
Wait, what?
That doesn't happen.
I rephrased the question. I kind of remember what you were asking.
Yeah, I was just curious if you have clients, or do you advise clients that have a podcast to also blog, or maybe show notes, like creating other pieces, like SEO, right? When I say show notes, different things to draw in people who weren't looking for their podcast, right? We're all talking about, we've mentioned several ways if we're looking for a podcast, how we might go about that. But to get in front of people who either aren't podcast listeners or certainly were not listening to, or maybe are, but they're not listening to your podcast and you want them to, and that they would enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely. So one big thing is, and this is obviously something you hope to build out of a podcast, but if you have an email list already, take advantage. Email lists are like gold.
Which is amazing, right? Like it's still,
these things are gold. Yeah.
It always has been. And
still are.
If you can get into, if you have a good email list, or if you have an email list that you've never used specifically for your podcast, definitely hit the email list. I would say the second thing is probably writing blog posts that relate around the podcast topics. You still should write blog posts. Blog posts are still valuable, obviously, because of SEO, but people still read. So writing blog posts that are not directly what the episodes or maybe even your podcast is talking about, but are loosely related, always gives you a reason to backlink it to the podcast. And you should have your podcast on your website. That is a must. And you should have a website if you have a podcast. So if you guys have said that before, I totally agree with you.
Yes, I think we agree.
And if you consider yourself not a writer, that's why you're a podcaster, take a little bit of time to learn how to be a writer. Don't write here's my title, and then I add 7 paragraphs. Break that bad boy into chunks, make some subheadlines and things like that, because people don't read, they scan, and they scan it first. And when they see enough subheadlines, they go, oh, this looks like it actually applies to me. Then they'll read it. So it's one of those things where writing is more than just putting, words on a piece of paper. You got to put a little thought into it.
Yep.
Or pay someone who is
right.
To do it.
Exactly. Or pay someone. Yeah.
Start a Patreon, but I only get $20 in my Patreon. Yeah, but I pay someone $20 an hour, like 1 hour, to write my show note. Whatever it is, right? Like, do what you have to do. Like all these things, if they're harder to get done, there may be different ways to go about it to accomplish them. If like, kind of, Jared, what is your goal? Like, right? Like, if you really want to grow, if you want to do this thing, if you're starting a podcast, to just start a podcast, you're looking for the audience that is there, it's out there, who's going to find you. Cool. But we're always looking for new ways to help podcasters find more audience, because then oftentimes they can do more with that. You don't need a big audience, but the more people listen, the better. I mean, it is kind of why we're putting it out there. We do want to find all the people. Hopefully you want to find the people who actually want to get the podcast. And that's always the thing. You know that the audience exists. And what's beautiful is a lot of times when you pick a topic, you can see other shows. And again, I've also said a lot of times why I like YouTube is I know where the ceiling is. I know where my goals are. There are plenty of channels on video cameras and reviews of audio gear. And I see some of them have 500,000 subs, right? Maybe. I know I can get that. In a podcast, I don't know what it is. I don't know how many people listen to Dave. I don't know how many people listen to Daniel, but people do. You could always ask. You could be like, what can I expect, right? So it's out there.
I think the other thing we should do is I'm finding that in some cases people, because especially now the hotter podcasting gets, if you truly have no clue what a podcast is, you might feel intimidated to say, I remember I was at this is 2 years ago, I was at a picnic and I walked in and somebody said, oh, there's Captain Podcast is here, something like that. It was my family. They're poking fun at me. And finally, my one cousin said, okay, I'm going to ask. And I'm like, what? And they're like, what's a podcast and how do I listen to one? So I think if we can open up that door, if you are talking about something and you say, yeah, I talked about that on my podcast, you might want to throw out, has anybody ever showed you how to listen to a podcast? And if they have, they're like, oh yeah, I use Pocket Cast all the time. But if they haven't, you've opened that door for them to go, no, like, could you show me? And I think that people might be intimidated to ask, like, what's a podcast?
Definitely.
What? Yeah. So if we can open that door to go, look, here's a safe place for you to say, I don't know what a podcast is, because they're, well, what are you up to? 51%. So that means 49% of people haven't listened to one yet. So there's a door there that needs open and we can kick it open just a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is definitely like our responsibility to kind of lead the charge to let people know how to consume the media and why you should. And the thing I always tell people when they're like, oh, what's a podcast? Or, how do you listen to podcasts? To me, it's always about being able to consume media at your own pace. And, it's topics you want to consume. It's great for, obviously long drives or just walking the dog. So I think it's still the piece of media that's just really easy to consume, and you don't have to worry about attention span issues. You don't have to worry about scrolling through 1,000 videos on your feed. It does have its own little niche place where and when you should kind of consume it.
Yeah, we were talking about attention span, and I think, podcasts prove the opposite of that, right? People, yeah. But it's, I think Daniel is speaking, when you have the whole internet in front of you, it is very easy to go from one thing to another and be distracted. Podcast it's intentional in that you're going to choose to sit back for an hour and listen to something.
Let me ask you guys, do you ever listen to podcasts at your laptop or your desktop, or is it always on a mobile device?
I do. It's one of the reasons why I like Pocket Cast, because they have a great browser player and they sync with your show. So I'm at work and I work from home, which there are no office mates. Twitter is my water cooler. So I can listen to a podcast out loud. So I do, not as much at all. It does happen. I still hold to the theory that podcasts are not really a social experience. Most people do not want to hear the podcast you're listening to, even in the car. Or my wife and I listen to the same podcast, but guess what? She's on a different part than I am. Right. So we're not listening together. But who else?
Yeah, I mean, I use Overcast. So again, they have an interface. I can't listen to podcasts at work because I have to listen in like 12-second increments. So while I'm importing somebody from Anchor, I'm like, all right, hold on, click. And so I'm usually watching YouTube videos because they're shorter. So it's not something, but when I do, it's almost always on the phone, in the car. If I'm not sitting in front of my desk, I'm definitely listening to a podcast.
Why do you ask, Jared?
Oh, I'm curious because honestly, like I can't listen to a podcast when I'm sitting at my desk. If I'm typing something and someone's talking to me at the same time, it's just not working.
Yeah, but I'm talking, usually that's why I don't do it that much. It's data entry type stuff, right? It's not what I'm doing, but it is busy work where I can.
Mindless stuff.
Yeah,
mindless.
If I do listen to one while I'm working, it's usually like a sports podcast.
Yeah.
Where it's just kind of like just murmur in the background,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been using Bluetooth earbuds for years and recently got the AirPods Pro, which I really like, by the way. And it's something that's really easy for me to just take everywhere. And I really like that it's so easy for me to transition from one task to another and carry the podcast with me. And I also use Overcast. I really like the Overcast app, the experience there. And even though you can listen to your Overcast podcast through the browser, it doesn't have Smart Speed or Voice Boost features in the browser. Those are only on the phone. So I just prefer to listen through my phone. And also, besides, there's no transition for me to do that. I can get up, move around, do anything without having to stop my podcast. But if I transition to listening through my computer, then I have to take out earbuds, turn on my speaker, put on different headphones, something like that, switch over. It's a 1 minute transition, which, what's 1 minute? But that's time I could be listening to the podcast.
I have started syncing my phone to the woman in the tube from Amazon behind me. And then I have an Apple Watch so I can pause the podcast on my watch. That on occasion will work if I'm doing things in the office.
Well, Dave, did we provide the value this round? I think there's some takeaways. I'm asking because I'm asking that because it's like what else? What else do we got? Do we have anything as we work our way out of here? Do we want to give some tips about, what can we do to help? What could everyone do? I mean, people listening to this or watching are generally podcasters, right? So we have shows. We don't have a problem finding podcasts, even though sometimes I do. We know how it's done. We're going to find new shows if we really want to. But what about people who haven't listened to podcasts at all, right? That's part of the mission of International Podcast Day, right? Where we go out, we're trying to get new audience. So how can we help podcasters get new podcast listeners?
Jody Livingston in the chat room brings up, I think, something that's good. Jody said, has anyone asked about, or has it been discussed, podcast trailers for your show? And there's now that trailer format that we can use that currently it's just Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and maybe a couple other podcast apps that support the trailers. But I think that it's supported and that it's something we can easily link to and highlight in those apps. I would hope encourages us to create more like that. And I think taking a trailer perspective with all of our podcasts could maybe be a way to help people, because you could stick that trailer on the homepage of your website. Click here to learn what this podcast is about, or maybe some actually probably better text. Talk to Jared about some better text for that. But trailers in these apps that highlight the trailers give people a chance to hear what the podcast is about beforehand. This is so much better than like an episode 0 or anything like that. And I hate episode 0s, but I love trailers. So I think I would be really interested to see if there could be some kind of split test done or just some experiments to see how much do trailers actually help us grow, because I think that could be one of the underused tools that we have at our disposal right now.
Totally agree.
The one thing I miss from the early days of podcasting is everybody had a 30-second promo. Everybody had one. And it didn't matter. It was kind of stupid.
Exchange.
Yeah. I still own podcastpromoswap.com somewhere. Because that was just a thing, and it was kind of stupid at the time, but there were only X amount of podcasts. So you'd have some guy with a NASCAR show swapping promos with a blues podcast. It wasn't like they were really like these peanut butter and jelly, these fit great together. And I'm not sure why that went away. I don't know if people just started holding their cards a little closer to the vest or what, but I mean, Daniel mentioned it earlier. I get a fair amount of traffic from people go, oh, I heard you on the round table and I followed you over here. And so I know it's on one hand, I would love to have more promos. On the other hand, I also know when I hear somebody start off a podcast with like, this show is part of the, 3 Guys, 1 Beer show network. Find out more shows over at 3 Guys, 1 Beer. And I never go over there. That does not entice me to want to go over there. So it's again, goes back to, it's got to be something, we got to think trailer. I mean, what does a trailer do? It makes you want to go see the movie. And it can't just be, oh, it's a podcast about podcasting. Check it out, blah, 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 blah. It's got to what's in it for you? And who's it for?
And I think the key is that you didn't have to get that trailer in front of people who weren't looking for it, right? That they weren't looking for the podcast, right? I mean, maybe they're in your niche. Like obvious answers, you post it on social, it's on your websites, maybe it's on YouTube. The trailer goes everywhere, right? That is your hook. If you have that newsletter, like Jared was saying, get it in your newsletter, right? You probably have a lot of people subscribe to you, and maybe they were already there. They weren't there for the podcast, but now you have one. I mean, I work for a big organization where I feel like this is still a problem. You know, we have like 40,000 members, and I don't know if half of them know we produce a podcast like about their topic. It can be tough, especially if you know those people are not in the places that you traditionally are reaching out to. I think that's also one of the reasons why email is so important, is because people still check their mail, right? So they might not be on Twitter, Instagram, all these places, but they still check their email.
I'm going to steal something that I'm going to talk about on my Monday show. I just watched a documentary about Taylor Swift, and she did something that I don't think enough podcasters do. And that is, she asked her audience to do something. So many people or our problem is we ask them to do too much. Yeah. Follow me on Instagram, tweet me on this, and do the face chat and the tick lock and the blah, 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 blah. It's like, ugh. And she's 16 at the time. And she's like, there's a radio station, WKR, whatever. And she goes, I want you to call them and ask to play the song Tim McGraw by Taylor Swift. Very specific, exactly what to do. Please go do it. And boy, off her army went. And I think sometimes podcasters don't do that. We give them too many things to do, or don't ask them to do anything. And it's like, even if you just said, hey, if you like today's show, could you do me a favor? Could you tell one person about this?
Dave, can you finish this for me? If you like what you hear.
Exactly. Go tell somebody.
Go tell someone. That's Dave's jingle in his podcast.
So,
which I love, because it's like, it's a fun jingle and you're actually telling people what to do. It sticks in your head, by the way.
And I can play it legally. I have permission from everybody. But even Jared was saying, get that email list fired up, because what if you had a trailer that was easy to share? I was thinking back, Marcus Couch is in the chat room. He's another OG. And he said, I used to make a new promo every week. And we used to all put them in, it was on your sidebar. Like, here's the 30-second promo. And if you had that and could easily share it, either in a little video headliner or an audio thing or whatever, get it out there. Yeah. Marcus says, I asked the fans of the Bulls podcast to have the players record intros for me. How cool is that? I got 4 players just emailing me intros, telling me to ask the fans to stop. It's a beautiful thing. Worked for Howard Stern. Nice. He was always sicking people. Be nice or I'll sick my audience on you.
All right. Well, that's some good stuff going out. I think you have a way to go and fire up your audience to tell more people. Different things that we could probably be doing to get our podcast in front of new audiences, or even an audience that exists but is not listening to your podcast. And I think there's a lot to be said in there for measuring all of this, like what we don't know. Like, do we know if anyone came from an audiogram? When you ask someone to do something and they email you about it, like the Bull situation, like you this is working, right?
Yeah.
Dave, you're saying you're getting results because people come from over here. They tell you. So Dave actually shows up when I ask him to join us for the next round because it works, right? So there's value in talking to your audience, even if it's just like a survey. I don't know. I don't know that enough podcasters actually know what they need to do more of because of what their current audience has done already, maybe. I don't know what you guys think about that, but do you guys poll your audience? Do you talk to your audience?
Not as much as I should. I mean,
I'm surprised by that, because Dave, you probably seem like better than anyone.
Well, I asked them
pictures that used to have pictures of your audience behind you, so I know you're in touch with your audience.
They're on the door.
There you go.
But I mean, I asked them a question of the month, but that's actually hard to do. I have a hard time coming up with questions because I don't want it to be just about me. I try to come up with a question that would benefit everybody. So, but
the 5 and 5 was always very participatory, which is you ask people to tell us what their last 5 podcasts to listen to, not their top 5.
See, and again, if I don't ask for those, I don't get them.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, they kind of primed the pump and somebody would hear it. And I am amazed I think it's just because a lot of podcasters are introverts, that I'm always like when I do the question thing, there are times when I have to go to my email list. Again, email works. And I'll say, hey, if you want your podcast in front of a few thousand people, here's what you got to do. Just go over here, click on the button, hit record, and you're done. And I still get people like, oh, I'm like,
I have another. I mean, that actually makes me think, what has someone what has another podcaster done that has gotten you to take action? So for me, I did a 5 and 5 back in the day. I definitely did that. It got me to do something. And back then, probably had to use like a real telephone. So long ago. I that one sticks into my mind. Like I've told that story before. Daniel, what has another podcaster done that actually made you, take action beyond listening? Like that's like a high threshold activity. Like I tell people all the time, people say, "Oh, I'm saying these things. I'm telling people to email me." No one emails me. No one sends me a tweet. It's hard to move someone from podcast listener to action. So as I was ending this round, we're starting a new round. We're just going to go off on the tangent here for a few minutes. Daniel.
They've asked for it. That's a big thing. Like, I'm surprised. I hate falling into grooves and going with the crowd. So I feel like I'm fighting myself whenever I'm watching a YouTube video and they say,
you have to say it. I know.
They say, smash that
Find
like
a new way
button.
to say it. You don't have to say smash. Look, come on.
But they say it, and I'm amazed like how often I don't think to click like until they say it.
Yeah, until they say it, yeah. 100%.
And for podcasts that I listen to as well, it's when they ask a certain question. It's something that resonates with me. Either they're asking a question or they're offering something extra that I want, like maybe text this code to this thing to get this thing, or go to this address to get this thing that I'm offering, or to see this picture of something that we're talking about. It's when it's something, that's clearly communicated and it's requested, and there's something about it that connects with me in some way.
Yeah, and just to your point, like that's like marketing 101, right? No matter what the format is, if we're talking about blog posts, if we're talking about a video or a podcast, or even like a sign, or like that old school magazine article, that you'd get like, hey, fill out this thing and send it in and we'll give you a t-shirt. This is just like marketing 101. The content has to be good and it has to touch the right audience at the right time. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what the format is. And this is just like a problem that every business, every person or brand is always looking to kind of solve.
So Andrew at Clueless on Twitter, when he saw the email list, so podcastersroundtable.com/guests, get on the email list, and you can get on the show because of it. But you'll also know when new episodes come out. And Andrew saw this, so before we went live, and he sent a tweet and he said, "Ooh, next Podcasters Roundtable looks interesting." I said, "Be interesting to hear how people go about this." He's talking about finding new podcasts. He says he searches in Apple Podcasts for a topic he's interested in. That's how he finds them. Then tries a few after checking a couple reviews. And I sent back, that's an interesting use case, actually relevant use case for asking for reviews, right? This is something we talked about here. Sometimes people might, I don't know if I might say that they waste their call to action. Or Dave, you said we asked too many things. We hear reviews and people always think that's going to make me number one in iTunes or Apple Podcast. We do not think that is the case, but this is a real life case where someone's actually reading it to decide which podcast he's even going to sample in the first place. So again, having to ask, that's one of the things we have to ask. If YouTubers say smash that like button too much, podcasters say, please rate and review my show. It means everything to us. It makes all the difference.
Resubscribe.
Makes all the difference. Yeah,
it helps us be found. That's the one that I just go,
found 100%.
No, it doesn't.
It might help people choose your podcast. I switched to using that language a few years ago.
Like Yelp.
It helps people choose our podcast.
He also mentioned how he can tell when people have just left reviews for the sake of, because someone left a review to do this boosting behavior that everyone thinks they're going to get. Right?
The Amazon behavior.
Yeah. But you can tell when a review is actually helpful for whether you're going to listen to that podcast. So, get some of those, get some real reviews, ask real listeners if they have something of value to share that with the potential people who might find the show on one of these platforms.
And have them, going back to the email list, have them email you or leave a comment on the blog post, because I feel like those are going to be a lot more valid than the random iTunes reviews.
Yeah, and I don't know that the general public can spot it, but I sure can. When all of a sudden on January 18th, you know, Joe Schmo gets 18 reviews, all 5-star, and they all say things like, great podcast, love the host. I'm like, oh, really? Wow, what an interesting coinkydink that he got
Someone
18
just
reviews.
spent $5 on Fiverr recently.
Yeah.
And the funny part is, I think we used to do that in the early days, not as like a a service that people are going out and paying money for. Like you would tell, I mean, it was so early. Like people, even the amount of people listening to podcasts. If we had an audience of 50 people, we're like, hey, it was kind of. I felt like it's easier to be in touch with an audience of 50 people, so don't take that for granted. But or don't think that that's not enough. Like go out and speak to the audience. We talked about getting to know your audience. I lost my train of thought, but what was I saying? Someone else was paying attention, maybe. Anyways, back in the day, it wasn't a spammy thing. This is what I was saying.
Right.
It was like we didn't know what actually helped you get exposure in iTunes at the time. So, you would go in and be like, love the show, 5 stars, right? But now these days it's become podcasting has grown enough to attract scams.
Absolutely.
Anything else, Dave? Did you mention what someone had done to actually move you off a podcast and do something? I mean, even like buy a course. Like I'm talking about do anything. Like what was something compelling enough to move you from just a listener to anything else? You went to their website, because a lot of people listen to the podcast. They'll never go to your website.
Monica Rivera on You Want to Do What did an episode on it was like 3 easy ways that you can save money. And there was some service that like you sign up for it. And let's say I buy something for $1.38. It takes the other 62 cents and puts it aside. It rounds everything up. And then somehow that money gets put into a pot and you get it later. And I was like, you know what? That might be an easy way. And I bet it adds up and blah, blah, blah. And so I went over and checked out the service. And then I saw where it was like $3 a month. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm going to lose half the money I save a month to pay for the service. But I did get up and look at it. So that was one. Usually if you're going to save somebody time or money, that's the 2 things we don't have enough of. And that might get them, or if you can help them avoid a headache. Again, going back to Jared and Marketing 101.
Yeah, we used to do a thing on our podcast early on where we would do what's catching our attention, and it'd be me and my my business partner. We'd run the podcast, and we'd each spend like 10 or 15 minutes just talking about the things that have caught our attention, and that usually was like a tool or an app or something that we were utilizing in our lives that we could share with the audience. And obviously we weren't getting any profit from it, but we'd say, hey, go check out this app. And we actually got pretty good feedback because we were giving people tangible things that they could actually go and do. And it wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't gimmicky. It was pretty it was pretty real when we would tell them these tips and tricks.
That's almost proof. I mean, what's nice about doing that in the early day too, if you have like this desire to get advertisers, you can show it works, right? Like it's like, if we really like the product, recommending it here moves people to that thing. We've done it, right? Look at this feedback. Like think of everything as an opportunity, right? People, again, afraid to do things for free. But you got to build. And then if you're looking for money, like that stuff, it's just not there in the beginning. You got to build toward it.
Yep.
But that's cool. There's some things that everyone can do to help grow their show or to get more, interaction with their audience, you name it. Growing our podcast involves all of that stuff. So as we head out, let us know one podcast that we can find of yours, and then thanks for being on. So Jared, thanks for being the new roundtabler.
Cool.
And
thank you guys for having me. This is awesome.
Appreciate all of your insights and sharing all that stuff. That was, I think it was helpful for sure.
Cool. Thank you guys.
And what's the one? You have more than one.
We do. I'll give you one. We're kind of backlogged a little bit right now because of production, but it's called @Run with Toby. You can find it in any podcasting platform, or just go to our website, tobyagency.co.
So I don't know what that. So I would think that's a running podcast, but now I'm thinking it's
not,
more like I'm going running and I'm learning about marketing.
Yeah, bad naming convention. It was early on. Podcasting 101 title does matter now. We called it Run with Toby because a lot of our slogans at the time were like marketing slogans. So come run with us, we'll help you So we just named the podcast after like our social handles and things like that.
So
But
awesome. Well, that's learning opportunity. So how do you get around that? The name is still the same. You didn't rebrand when you decided that's not the best way to go. So how do you make sure that people know what your podcast is about?
So again, it's pretty like we're very focused on the audience that we're looking for. So we're not trying to cast a giant net and beat out, XYZ other agency for like fans. We have a very specific audience, but we've morphed that one from a marketing podcast, marketing centric, to a cultural podcast. So it actually does make a little bit more sense because we talk about like things inside and outside of the agency that are more about the people that we have working in the agency. So the running part actually makes a little bit more sense now.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, check it out if that's your thing. Daniel J. Lewis, thanks as always.
Thank you. Check me out over at theaudacitytopodcast.com.
I would ask you what that's about, but
naming conventions again.
the
guts, the courage, the power.
It's inside humor we use here to bond with our community at the end of the round, because only the real roundtablers are left. I'm kidding. You can say that when anyone would be offended.
Or those who can't get to the stop button fast enough on their phones.
That's right. Awesome. Dave Jackson, thank you so much, man.
I have a specific thing. We'll go this route. Right. If you'd like more of me, simply take your phone right now, text SOP to 31996. That's SOP to 31996.
I was always afraid. I never understood that. Like, that's been around forever. And I'm like, wait, I just text that's not a phone number. Who am I texting? I don't get it. I feel like that thing, even though it's been around, maybe everyone else knows, but I feel like people knew, like, it's a new way of interacting with people. And they're like, I don't know. I feel like it needs more explanation. Does it work? How about that? Does it work?
It does work for presentations. Cause my first slide is always like text, blah, blah. And so while people are sitting there waiting for it
now, like,
yeah. So,
do you do it on your podcast?
Not as much as I should, which again, as you asked that, I'm like, you know what? Where do most people listen? We talked about that earlier on my phone, and yet I'm not asking for that specific thing. So that's all right.
TBD. We will follow up. That gives us a reason to come back. I like it. Great. All right. Podcastersroundtable.com/guest. Get on that email list. It'll send you a sign-up sheet. I'll actually know that you exist if you're not here in the chat or tweeting me or Dave or Daniel. We have to know you want to be on the show. That's the way to do it. We'll get you on around youtube.com/podcastersroundtable. But of course, podcastersroundtable.com. Dave, that's probably too many things. We'll commit our own sins here.
Okay. Sorry, there's too many.
I just want another buzzer.
You've overbid.
We will see now. Overbid. All the old game show theme songs coming to my head. Wave goodbye. God, we must leave. Must just make it stop, please.